Hello, everybody. My name is Brian Rinaldi, and thanks for coming. I'm going to be talking about web application architecture as it's related to Adobe Brackets, the open source project on GitHub that's created by Adobe. So before I get to talk about that stuff, talk a little bit about myself. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm the content and community manager at Adobe. We have a publication called the Adobe Developer Connection, where we publish, we publish lots of articles, tutorials by both developers outside Adobe and developers inside Adobe. And myself and Julie sitting over there, we manage the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, mobile content that's published on that site. And the cool thing, just in case those of you who don't know that as a resource, which I should have put the URL up there. Seems silly that I didn't, because that URL is actually my blog. But anyway, the Adobe Developer Connection, we don't actually just publish stuff that's specifically about Adobe. Like a lot of the articles we publish are about technologies and things that aren't necessarily connected to Adobe at all. So anyway, that is my blog, remotesynthesis.com. I also do a weekly roundup of the best links and things in JavaScript, CSS, HTML. So if you want to follow that blog, keep up with what's going on. And then that's my Twitter, of course. I don't mention, so Adobe has big offices right here, but I'm actually from Boston. So I fly out here a lot, but I get to be lucky enough to work out of Boston. But I am actually, you can find me easily in Boston. As some of you might have noticed, I'm wearing my Miami gear. I'm the guy walking around Boston in Dolphins, Miami Heat, and Miami Hurricanes gear. So it's pretty easily recognizable around Boston. It's not a lot of those. They're passionate about their sports there. But I grew up in Miami, so I stick with my teams. All right, so enough about me. So how many of you have already heard of brackets? Oh, good, most of the audience. I presented this last week in that audience, most of them had not heard of it. So for those of you that haven't, brackets is an open source code editor. Basically, it's a desktop application. I have it open here. Hold on, let me close this thing. This is what brackets looks like. It looks similar to other code editors you've probably seen, but it is actually open source, and it's out there on GitHub. There's a GitHub project that you can get at the code, clone it, do whatever you want with it. It is under the MIT license, I believe. So the interesting thing, though, about brackets, not only there are some cool features, and I'll show you a little bit of that before we move on, just to kind of give you an idea of what it does and what makes it special. But the really cool thing about brackets is that it is built with web technologies as well as editing those web technologies. So let me just kind of give you a quick tour. There's also, there's also, some of you may have heard of Edge Code. And Edge Code is a distribution of brackets, basically with the Adobe logo on it. It looks and feels much the same, but that's actually available via Creative Cloud. So brackets is available on GitHub, and Edge Code is available via the Adobe Creative Cloud. They're both free. I've talked to some people, there was some confusion sometimes about Edge Code. It is actually free. There's a free version of the Creative Cloud that you can get Edge Code, get Edge Animate. You get Edge Inspect with some limitations, like a single device at a time, but those are all free. It's not like a trial, it's a free version of the Creative Cloud. So Edge Code is free, as well as brackets. The difference is, there's not a huge difference right now. I'll tell you a little bit about the differences, but I'll show you. But the big difference is going forward, this Edge Code will have more integration with Creative Cloud services and other Adobe services, while brackets will still be out there on GitHub, and kind of those pieces won't be built in. So let me show you. So this, as I said, is brackets. Actually, I'm going to show you here in Edge Code a little bit better, because I've got different things open. So one of the cool things about brackets, one of the unique features, you can see that it comes with built-in JSLINT errors and stuff like that. But the neat thing is, if I go here like this div here, I'm going to just hit Control E, and there's a lot of styles associated with this one, so it's a bit kludgy on the screen here. But you'll see that a bunch of styles open up in that little window there. It shows me all the styles associated with this particular div across a number of style sheets. So I can actually switch the style sheets and see these are the styles that it found in my project that are associated with either a div or a div with that class slides. So it allows me to go in there and edit those inline without needing to move between file. You know, I'm going to move from my HTML file to my JavaScript file to my CSS file. You can actually edit JavaScript and edit CSS that way inline. So that's one of the really cool features. It's also got extensibility, so like they've got some plugins built in here. Well, I'm going to hide JSLINT for right now. Like this is a PhoneGap build plugin that was built. This one actually, the PhoneGap build plugin is actually available also on GitHub, so it's totally open source as well. See if I remember my password. Of course, I seem to have forgotten my password. Hold on. So I wanted to show you this feature. I probably just mistyped it. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I just did this last week. I know my password. It might be something wonky with the internet connection. That might be what's going on, and it's just, yeah, anyway. Well, assuming it worked, you can imagine. Let's all imagine. Close your eyes, and I'll paint a picture where that bottom portion of there shows all my PhoneGap build projects, and I can actually rebuild them right there. I can just click to have the, those of you know, do you know what PhoneGap build is? All of you? No? Okay, PhoneGap build is a service. I'm going to give you the 2-second pitch. PhoneGap build is a service where I can actually push my files out in the cloud, and it'll do the different builds for the different devices for me. So it'll build like for iOS and Android and Windows Phone and whatever else you might want to support. So that's all in the cloud. So in this case, it would show me all my projects out there. It'll show me the different builds for the different devices like Android, iOS, so on. I could actually click them, and it would show me basically you just scan a little QR code and it'll install it on your phone. So it'll show me the QR code. I can scan it right here and install it on my phone. I can rebuild it. I can actually connect it to the files on my project, push those files out, have it rebuild, and all of this within never leaving the brackets code editor. So that's some of the stuff that's like the integration that we're trying to work on. There's also Adobe Edge Web Fonts, which we announced a couple weeks ago. What that one allows you to do is, it's kind of like Google Web Fonts. If you guys most of you are probably familiar with Google Web Fonts, but I would come in here and let's say I'm going font family, and then you see it'll list me a bunch of fonts. I can go here and click Browse Web Fonts, and all these are available via the Adobe Web Fonts, Adobe Edge Web Fonts, and I could just pick this one, it'll include it there for me. There's different things it'll do, but basically it'll go out there and look at what's available via the Edge Web Fonts, and I can pull it in. So that's the kind of integration that they're trying to do with Edge code specifically. So like that Web Fonts comes with Edge code, but isn't built into brackets. The PhoneGap build one is out there on GitHub as well. So if you want that one, you can easily add it into two brackets rather than just Edge code. So what makes brackets really interesting, as I was mentioning before, is it's built with web technology. So it's built with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, even though it runs natively on your Windows or Mac, and they're working on Linux, but not Linux yet. But it runs natively on your desktop like a regular native application, but it's built with those technologies. It's also built using a project called CodeMirror, which is open source as well. I don't know, those of you who have heard of CodeMirror, it's basically a web-based code editor. And so that's a big part of what Brackets uses to display and edit code. I know we actually supported the project and everything to help get some of this stuff done, and that obviously plays a big role in Brackets. It also runs on the Brackets shell is basically, it's built with the Chromium embedded framework. and that's what allows it to run on your desktop. The interesting thing, if you're curious about that is a separate open source project, the Brackets shell. So if you go to Brackets, the Brackets GitHub project, so if you were to go, let's see if my internet access is working. Yeah, it is. So if you go here, this is all the HTML, JavaScript, CSS code that makes up Brackets, but there is actually a separate project that is called Brackets shell, that is the shell that it runs in on the desktop. So if you were curious about how that's built, you can look into that. The other funny thing about it is that since it is built with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but it's designed to edit HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, is that you can edit brackets in brackets. So I'm actually looking at the Brackets code in Brackets. By default, when you open it, you get the Brackets code showing here. So it's kind of a very meta kind of thing, you know, editing brackets with brackets. It's just, but anyway. In fact, that's how the team built it. They used Brackets to build Brackets. So it's kind of interesting. So the idea of this presentation was, well, let's say I don't want to build another Brackets. I just want to learn I want to dig into the code and see what Adobe's doing and what other open source developers, because we've got a lot of contributors who are contributing to it, what's going on in the code. I want to learn some techniques and things from the code. Well, what could I learn? Right, that's basically what I'm going to present to you here. But you also have to think, well, I can take some lessons out of it, but there are a number of things that Brackets is what would make it different from anything I'd likely build, because you know, I'm typically, you know, if I'm working for my company building a project, most of the time I'm not building an open source project expecting a large number of contributors, but there are things that Brackets does specifically that geared towards, like, you know, handling contributions and making it easier for people to contribute, that if you're building your project, you don't necessarily have to consider. Brackets doesn't run in the browser right now. It only runs in this desktop shell, and more than likely your application isn't going to run in a desktop shell. You're targeting the browser. So there's things that they didn't need to consider that you would need to consider, and vice versa when you're doing that. It's purely optimized for displaying and editing code. This is not like a typical web page. So you know, the thing is this is the view for Brackets. There's not a lot to it. You have basically your file picker here and your code editor here, and you have some pop-up menus and things and navigation. But this isn't, you know, there's not a lot of portions to a lot going on in the view portion of the code. So because it's purely about displaying and editing code, so more than likely your application isn't going to do that. And while this is something you might be strive for in whatever you're building, is that you want to be able to be extensible by third parties. That's a key part of what makes Brackets cool, is that you can write extensions for it. You know, but in your applications, you may or may not ever be worried about making your code extensible. So there's some things that I'll cover here that, you know, you may say, well, okay, I can learn a little bit from that, but it doesn't fit exactly because they're a bit of a different target. They also don't use any MVVM, MVC, whatever framework. There's none. I asked the team why that was. They said basically because there's not a lot of, as I said, there's not a lot of UI. There's not a lot of fine-grained UI. There's just this text editor, menu, projects panel. So they didn't feel like it was necessary. I think early on when I talked to them, they also felt like this might be a barrier towards people contributing. I think there seems to be less of an argument on that right now. And when I talked to the team recently, they actually said that they are, as they add more complex UI, they are thinking about whether to consider adding a framework or not, but as of right now, they don't have a framework. So one of the things when I started, I should preface this by saying I didn't write Brackets. I left that to much smarter engineers than me. Basically, this is me, like, just, I went through and I dug through the code and, like, okay, if I was learning from this code, what would I want to learn? So that's what I'm going to go through here. But there's a lot in there, and I'm going to kind of cover a lot of topics. I can't go into depth about every single one because there's a lot of stuff, but I'll give you resources that you can follow, like if you want to learn more about that particular topic. One of the things that I thought was interesting, I mean, I came into I'd done JavaScript on and off for a long time. For a while I was doing Flash, and then I kind of came back. And one of the things that was difficult when you kind of moving from an object-oriented language like ActionScript 3 back to JavaScript is that there was a lot of solutions for dealing with classes and inheritance and stuff, and I kept reading articles about how different people solved it. Some people wrote frameworks to deal with this, and other people did, other solutions. So I'm always very curious about, well, how somebody solved, like how they're writing that portion of it. So this is kind of how, there's a lot of classes inside of brackets. Actually, if we go into the code, I'll show you. Almost all of it is JavaScript. There are a few HTML pages, like this index.html, and I think in the views there's maybe one or two, I think it was here. No, it's not even there. There's oh yeah, here, HTML content. There's this main view. Other than that, everything else is pretty much JavaScript files. Every one of these things, you'll find lots of different extensions, a bit weird. So lots of different classes, basically, that make up brackets, and it's all JavaScript. And a lot of it looks kind of like this when you start digging into the initial code. Basically, you have the constructor for the class, and then they deal with any inheritance that's going on. Like this one is a multi-range inline text editor that actually inherits from the inline text editor. You see they set the prototype and the constructor, and then down there you'll see a couple of methods they're adding to the prototype of the multi-range inline text editor. Anything with an underscore, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is either an internal or private method. Anything that doesn't is a public method that's available. So that's how they use this convention to basically handle private and public methods. So it's a pretty straightforward, like there's no framework going on or anything to handle the inheritance and the classes here. It's pretty clean and easy to understand. It gets pretty complex because, as I said, there's a lot of different classes throughout brackets. But as you go through the code, I actually found it to be very, very simple. The other thing that they do is they use REQUIREJS. I'm sure this audience, last conference, nobody heard of REQUIREJS. How many of you are already using REQUIREJS in your project? Okay, a good number of you. How many of you don't know what REQUIREJS is? Only a few of you. Okay, so I won't do a lot of introduction to REQUIREJS, but basically they're using REQUIREJS throughout to handle all the dependencies. So REQUIREJS is AMD compliant for handling modules, loading of modules asynchronously, and they're using it throughout to do that. The interesting thing, though, I'll show you some of the code. So if you were to dig in and say, okay, well, let's see how they're using REQUIREJS, you'll notice that they do it here. They're loading they define the actual module up top, right? And then they load all the dependent modules. But some of you who've used REQUIREJS may say, well, that's not how I did it, right? You don't always calling this require method. And that's because they actually are using these, let me show you. They're using these common JS basic wrappers. So they use a AMD compliant kind of common JS. So they basically, the modules are common JS modules that they kind of make AMD compliant. So that's why they're using that to load all the modules. They're using this part of REQUIREJS to load it. So this would be they're loading up all the dependencies for this particular. I think this is also the multi-range inline text editor. They're loading in you can see they're loading in the inline text editor, the editor manager, the commands, and so on. For those of you who haven't used REQUIREJS, this is actually really interesting to see how they use it, but it's because there are so many dependencies throughout brackets. But it's also, I couldn't imagine them actually building this without using it because there's so many, because of the extent of the dependencies, managing those manually would be a nightmare. So you have to use something like REQUIREJS to actually load up all these dependencies for you. The other interesting thing about how they use REQUIREJS is that, as I said, it's extensible. So what they do is that in order that you don't load up a module in your extension that overwrite something that they have within brackets already, they actually give you a separate instance. So you can see the top part here, after you're defining your module up top, you see the first modules are using the same require method there, right? So this is, you're actually loading up the dependencies of your specific extension. Then down below, you're actually loading up the dependencies that you have within brackets that you require for your particular extension. So they do that so that there's not any conflicts, which I guess, like, this is one of those cases where it's like, you know, it's actually, found it interesting, but it's probably not necessarily, unless you're planning on some kind of extensibility, that's not necessarily something you'd need to consider, but it is interesting to see how they did that, how they get around the fact that we don't know what is in your extension when you load in that extension, right? So we have to kind of be careful you're not overriding what's going on already in brackets. So for testing, they use JSLINT. Those of you who don't know JSLINT, it was created by Douglas Crockford. Probably most of you have heard of Douglas Crockford. But it scans your JavaScript code, searches for errors, and gives you back a list of potential problems. JSLINT can be by nature, very strict. And I actually asked the team why, because I was asked by somebody why they chose JSLINT and not JSHint. And so a lot of the team on brackets was not initially JavaScript developers. They were developers from different other projects that were brought together on this that didn't necessarily, a lot of them were new to JavaScript. And they said they wanted something to be very strict initially. So that's why they chose JSLINT. But they're actually talking about right now, so as I noted, JSLINT is built into the project here, into brackets. Sorry. So I'm going to open here, let's see, where was that JSLINT? So I'm going to enable JSLINT. It's going to show me a bunch of errors on this one. This is because we're looking at my, well, come on, where is it? So it says it's there. So you know, this does say experimental build up there. So when I run into these problems, like, keep in mind, it's still a very new project. I'm going to reopen it and see if I can get it back. Just wanted to show you. So it uses it throughout the code, but it also has it built into the editor, and this is not showing it at all. Come on, JSLINT. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So it's not experimental build, it was brain fart. Okay, so yeah, in the HTML file, there we go. So you'll see right here, it's got a bunch of them down at the bottom. The interesting thing, because it's built in, you can actually use some of, like, I'll talk about some of these JSLINT, like, configuration things, but if I take these out, you'll see a bunch more. I'll talk about those a little bit more so you can understand what's going on. But if you open up any of these files, you'll see that every single one of them basically has a bunch of JSLINT configuration up here. So let me actually talk a little bit about how you use JSLINT. So JSLINT has a bunch of options. You can set a bunch of options for configuring it. So I've got that snippet there below is actually taken out of brackets. And what it's saying is, the first one is saying, like, okay, you can actually have multiple var statements, because by default it actually doesn't like multiple var statements. As I said, it's very strict by default. It has, maybe strict or opinionated, some might call it. So then secondly, it says, okay, you're allowed to use plus plus and minus minus. You can, the devel true is basically saying things like browser globals are defined. So as you can see actually from my example here, if you notice when I took out the configuration, it's going to give me part of the reason it gives me a bunch more errors here is because it's saying things like document was used before it was defined. So when I add in that, basically the piece of that devel true, it takes things like those errors away because it assumes that things like document are defined. And then it's saying, okay, okay, we don't care about initial underscores. We indent 4 spaces, and the maximum number of errors we're going to report back is 50. But you can also, another thing you can do in JSLINT is you can tell it what globals you have in that file that may not necessarily be inside that file. So like maybe there's something else you're loading in, like in this case, you see we're loading in the brackets is a class that's available throughout brackets. Obviously the $ is jQuery, and then I don't talk about that, but brackets uses jQuery. It's kind of assumed nowadays, right? So it uses jQuery as well. It uses mustache and less, and you'll see all of those classes are already predefined, so it won't tell you things like oh, you know, mustache is not defined or brackets is not defined. It won't report those errors because I configured it to say these things exist in this file. So those are some of the ways you'd use JSLINT to configure it so that it's a little less opinionated, but still gives you back useful errors. And I found it to be very helpful, even though, like I said, it can be very picky, but it picks up a lot of things that you might have missed. So a lot of times these JSLINT errors will actually give me things, and they'll show up, if there's an error, the code will show up red, and you can even click it and jump straight to the error in the code. So they also use Jasmine. How many of you are familiar with Jasmine? Anybody? A lot of people. Okay. So Jasmine is a behavior-driven development testing framework for JavaScript. So basically, they use Jasmine not for, if you dig into the brackets code when it opens up, you won't see this initially. You actually have to go either to the GitHub project and pull down the tests, or you can find it if you dig through the rest of the code that's sitting under the brackets folder in your program files. But there are a bunch of test runners in there. So if you configure brackets for development, let's say you want to be able to edit brackets, on the wiki there's a lot of instructions. The wiki has a lot of really good information for brackets, but it's instructions on how to configure it for development. Mine is not, but if it were configured for development, I could run these tests. Basically, they use Jasmine to make sure that when you submit any code, as long as you run these tests, at least they can guarantee that it meets a certain standard of functionality, right? So before you submit any code, you're supposed to run these Jasmine test runners and make sure that those all pass. Those are pre-written for you. So like this is one of them. So I pulled this off their GitHub project. So this one of the interesting things about Jasmine, it tries to write it in a very readable manner. So as you can see in this one, it's that before each is going to have, it's pretty self-explanatory. This is going to happen before each test is run. So I can do like some setup and things like that. And then the test is actually that function that says it, and then should not find attribute hints in an empty editor. So that's actually, okay, that's what I'm testing for, and then the code inside of there is what's going to do the testing, right? So that's how it's really easy to read and understand what the tester is supposed to do, which is the nice thing about Jasmine. For those of you who don't know Jasmine, I've got it open here. This is the Jasmine open source site. We've also got an article on the ADC that walks you through a little bit more in detail on the tutorials on how to use Jasmine. I also skipped over, we've got a nice one on REQUIREJS for those of you who don't know REQUIREJS by Aaron Hardy. It's really good. Anyway, so they've got a whole bunch of these tests that you obviously run before you submit any code. They also do templating using Mustache. So if any of you had checked it out before, for the longest time they weren't using any templating framework. But they decided only recently they added in Mustache. And part of it is because, as you see in this snippet here, so Mustache is pretty simple to understand. You can see the little mustaches there and like the save changes. It's going to replace out that stuff. A lot of this in brackets is actually done for localizing. So that's why like things like the save changes, don't save, save, and cancel are there. But then you'll see like message goes here isn't actually using that. So they use Mustache for a lot of their modal dialogues and things like that to swap out button text and things and so on. And it's all like, there's a whole bunch of localization files here. So they haven't localized it to a ton of languages. A lot of that is based on like people contributing. It's not that one. here you go. So you can see a lot of these localizing. So it's loading in these, a whole bunch of strings here for, this one is German, I believe, yeah. So a lot of that would replace out these save changes and so on text on the buttons. And that's what they're using Mustache for. It's pretty easy to understand how Mustache works. This is where we're basically setting the different variables that are going to get replaced out, like about icon is getting replaced by, it loads in these strings, and all those strings are in that brackets config, and so on. So then we're replacing out about icon, we're replacing out version name, and so on. And then we're rendering it out. So that's Mustache. Another thing it uses throughout is it uses less for CSS. It's probably, for those of you who do CSS, it's something you might use already yourself. The interesting thing, you can edit less files within brackets, of course. It understands that. But it does use it, basically it is built using it. So for those of you who haven't done any less, one of the things it allows you to import other files. So this one is actually, they have a bracket shared less CSS file that it's importing in that's used throughout. But then you can also do things like variables. Variables is like it's powerful, but it's really easy within less. So you'll see in that sidebar there, I'm setting that piece of code right there is actually broken up. Obviously, you wouldn't normally set the variable and then use it right away, but so I took two pieces and kind of combined them there. But I'm setting a variable named sidebar width to 200 pixels, and within my sidebar, I'm using that variable sidebar width to set the width. You can also do, there's a concept of scoping within less, so I can actually set a variable outside, so that sidebar width could be set there, but I could then set it inside my sidebar, and that would be scoped differently. So it would be scoped within this particular sidebar block, while the other one would be scoped outside of it. So that's one of the neat things. You not only use variables, but you have different scoping. There's also nesting that less handles. So this is not a particularly easy to understand example, and I did take it out of obviously all these examples are taken straight out of the code. The nesting thing is really, really cool because it makes it a little bit more straightforward to understand how different CSS rules are nested. For those of you who've done a lot of CSS, obviously, you usually have, like, you might have your body, and then you have your body A, and then you have your body A hover, and your body, so you have a bunch of classes that are all related, but they're all separate. So you have body, and then you have body A, and then you have body A hover, so on, right? So what nesting allows you to do is do that in a little bit more straightforward way. So in this case, we actually have body, and then a class body.resizing, and then body.resizing, and then this div projects A, so on and so forth. All of these are nested under body, and that's what's going on here. So it's actually saying, like, all of these are body.resizing, body, and so on and so forth. And all those have this cursor call resize. It's not the clearest example. They have a lot of nesting going on, so it was hard to find an example that made it a little bit easier to understand. But what it does is prevent you from having to do a different block for each of these, right? So it's one of the, less makes it really easy to kind of shorthand things, but it's also really powerful with things like variables. There's a lot more to it. I'm only kind of glossing over some of the stuff that you can see going on inside brackets, but it allows you to write your CSS in a much cleaner, more straightforward way, as well as add things like variables and stuff like that. You can even do calculations and things like that, so that you don't have to actually, things can be calculated for you automatically within less, and so on. So those are kind of some of the more the frameworks and other tools that they use within brackets. I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about their code conventions because I thought it was really interesting. I've been a part of development teams in my past, and I have to say, I always regret the fact that we didn't set a lot of these conventions up in advance. Like we didn't, those of you who work on big development teams, you can usually like open a file and say like, oh, you know, this is Joe edited this file because he always does this crap, and I hate the way he writes. You know, he uses spaces instead of tabs, and he doesn't do such and such, and you know, he camel cases instead of underscoring and so on. So they're very explicit about this because they have a lot of contributors who are, you know, they want you basically to go contribute. So they want to be able to make sure that you know, I can't go out there and say like, okay, this file looks completely different than this, and they're doing things a very different way. So they're fairly explicit about the code conventions. None of these are like anything you necessarily like, you know, oh, you know, that I have to use that, but they're all kind of good ideas that maybe you think, well, within our development team, maybe we'll steal some of those, the ones we like, and we don't, there's maybe ones we don't. So all their variable and function names use camel case. I think it's pretty standard, but there are a lot of people who do the underscores and things like that. I noticed they didn't specifically say lower camel case, but that's what they're using, I guess. So anyway, but they say, you know, no underscores for variables and function names. I kind of like this one. I mean, it seems stupid, and it's just the teams I was on, we never bothered to use it. Some people, I talked to some people who really hate this convention here, but other people love it. Which is that any variables that refer to a jQuery object have to have that little $sign in front of it. So that sidebar is obviously referring to a div of, or yeah, with an let's say a div, I don't know what it is, but a div with an ID of sidebar, right? So it's a jQuery object, and I have to prefix it with that little $sign. That way you can easily look through the code and say, oh, okay, this particular variable is a jQuery object, and be clear of like what you can do with it, right? So, you know, rather than just using it with nothing in front of it. As I said before, they prefix anything that's supposed to be private with the underscore. I know there some, you know, this was one of the ones I meant to ask them about this, because I know there are some patterns and things that help you protect things, make them more private. But in this case, they kind of rely on convention, where everything underscore is supposed to be understood that is private. It's not really private, as we all know, but that's supposed to be like, okay, you're supposed to assume that it's private. Another thing was, and this is another one I kind of like. I don't really think it's that key, but I like the fact that they use, whereas variables use the camel casing, they actually, all their IDs and classes have to use dashes. This may not make a big difference to you, but there are cases where like you might actually find them in your code and get it's a little easier to tell what is a class or an ID and what is actually referencing a variable. This was an interesting one because I had some people ask me, because it was a bit like, okay, there's not a particular reason for this other than stylistics in some respects. Like I asked why they chose to do this. They ask you to use array for each instead of using either a for loop or using jQuery's each looping. And so somebody came up to me after I presented this last week, and they said, well, you know, in their tests, actually the for loop was faster and blah, 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 you know. And I asked the team, and they said, well, first of all, they did find like certain ones were faster when you were iterating over maybe thousands of items, that they didn't feel like this was a big deal. I do think, and in fact, I didn't specifically question on this, but you know, you got to remember they are also dealing with a desktop application, so some of the stuff, some of their performance and things like that, they're a little bit less concerned than you might be on your website, because they're not running within the confines of the browser. Particularly when they're loading files and things, like this is all that stuff is going to be much faster. So the reason they did this was partly not for performance reasons. They just have a preference throughout that things you can do without jQuery, that you can do in straight JavaScript, they prefer you just use the straight JavaScript and not use jQuery. Which, you know, I think makes sense. I mean, but obviously it's up to you in your particular project whether that makes sense to you. But I actually like that reasoning. You know, it kind of made sense to me because it's clean enough in the array for each. They felt like it was a clean, easy way to write it. and without the jQuery. And that doesn't apply just to this. In general, they prefer, if you can do it without jQuery, do it without jQuery. So another interesting thing that they use, and I'm not going to go through a lot of examples of it because there aren't a ton, but those of you who know Bootstrap, I'm sorry I rushed through this presentation, I apologize, but so those of you who know Bootstrap can pretty much tell that things like the UI is done using Bootstrap, like this button and the modal dialog you can tell are Bootstrap. If you're interested in how they used it, I mean, there's not a lot of it going on yet, but the UI is getting more complex as they add more dialogues and more windows and things like that. And so it's becoming a bigger part of the project, but you can dig into the code and see it. So maybe I do. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on inside the code. And I didn't cover those here. So they have a whole sense of document and file management. They have these document classes and these file classes that abstract the way you interact with files on the file system and so on and so forth. So it's actually, it's really interesting, and there's a great article by a guy, David DeRate, that goes a lot through how that works. So he kind of digs into the document classes, and I won't let's show you the article too much here, but he digs into how that works and how it actually abstracts out the accessing of files. It also abstracts out the editor as well. So they have a class for the editor. My understanding is they didn't want to create these like tight dependencies. So even though they're relying on CodeMirror, they didn't want to build in like, where it was tightly coupled with CodeMirror. So they have this editor class where anything you want to interact with the editor, you don't call anything directly on CodeMirror. You're actually calling this editor class that then talks to CodeMirror. And they do that throughout the project on a number of things. Like I said, when I talked to them about JSLINT, they were like, well, we're fairly happy with JSLINT right now. What our idea is to make it pluggable. So you can, let's say you want to use JSHint or whatever other, project for that purpose that you have, well, you can just plug it in. So the goal is down the road you'll be able to plug these things in. It's very, because they haven't tightly coupled any of the pieces with these external dependencies so much. They also use the jQuery promise object for handling asynchronous operations. There's a whole article on this. They have about reference counting versus weak references. They have up on the wiki. It's pretty interesting. Obviously, there are no weak references in JavaScript, so they're using this reference counting to manage all the list of the different classes that they've already pulled in and object, and then that way when you close something, they make sure that they eliminate all the references to it and so on. It's kind of interesting because of the scale of the project and because of how much code is going on there to see how they manage that. Throughout they use this command pattern for handling user input. So like, so every time you click something or whatever, it sends out a command that's passed well, sorry, it's a bit late in the day, so it's beer o'clock already, and I'm clearly showing it. They also encapsulate state in these different commands and things like that, so that they can manage the state of the UI. Another really, really interesting thing, and it's probably like way above my head to really get into it, which is why I don't. But so one of the really cool features of brackets is that it has this live preview. So you need Chrome for the live preview to work, but what it does is it actually, when I can type CSS, I can modify CSS even if I'm in the HTML file, and let's say I'm editing the CSS using that shortcut that I was showing you earlier. So I can edit that CSS, and in my browser it'll actually change it as I type. So you'll be able to see the changes as you type. And that actually uses a WebSocket connection to communicate with Chrome to send those changes over so that they're immediately previewable. It's really nice to be able to, like, say, you can have your browser open in one screen and your in brackets open in another, and you're just editing your CSS and seeing how that actually shows up on the browser as you type. So it's a really nice feature, kind of designed to prevent. So one of the key things about brackets that they're trying to do, both with the inline editing of CSS and JavaScript and with this feature, is to prevent you from constantly having to kind of switch context, like, okay, I'm in my HTML file, now I'm in my CSS file, now I'm in my JavaScript file, now let me go over here. Now that I've edited all those 3 files, let me go over here and refresh the browser. The idea is you can do it all in one file, and those changes are immediately shown in the browser. So there's a whole series. I definitely recommend checking out the wiki that's on the Brackets site, because the developers are very, very open about what they're doing. Obviously, it's on GitHub. That's the point, right? And they post a lot of details about how these things work and how, their investigations of different technologies and stuff like that. So it's a really useful resource for that stuff. Thanks for coming.